The tension in the congressional hearing room was already thick when Dick Morris leaned into his microphone with that signature smirk. What came out of his mouth next would shock everyone watching and set the stage for one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. "Mr. Roumie," Morris said, his voice dripping with condescension, "maybe if you had grown up with some actual guidance instead of, well, whatever situation you came from, you'd understand how real policy works." The room went dead silent. Jonathan Roumie's eyes flashed with something that made even seasoned political observers lean forward in their seats. What happened in the next 5 minutes would leave Dick Morris speechless, destroy his reputation on live television, and turn Jonathan Roumie into a national hero. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was about to become the moment when a young actor and activist would expose one of the Republican Party's most powerful strategists as nothing more than a privileged bully who had finally picked on the wrong person. The stakes were enormous. Roumie knew that millions of people, particularly those from underrepresented communities, would be watching to see how he handled this attack. Would he shrink away from the confrontation? Would he lose his composure and give Morris exactly the reaction he was hoping for? Or would he find a way to turn his weapons against him while maintaining the dignity and professionalism that his followers expected? For his part, Dick Morris was supremely confident. He had taken down bigger names than some actor turned political advocate. He'd manipulated campaigns, taken down candidates, and orchestrated attacks on opponents with well-timed character assassinations. In his mind, this was going to be easy. The attack was personal. The response was nuclear. And by the end, Dick Morris would be trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, while Jonathan Roumie would cement his place as one of the most fearless voices in the public sphere. What made this moment even more shocking was the setting. This wasn't some heated debate on a talk show or a political rally where personal attacks might be expected. This was a formal congressional hearing with official protocols and supposed standards of decorum. Yet here was Dick Morris, a man who had advised presidents and shaped national politics for decades, choosing to launch a deeply personal attack on a public figure based on his background. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Morris, who had spent years complaining about the deterioration of political discourse and calling for more civility in politics, was about to demonstrate exactly the kind of behavior he claimed to oppose. But power and privilege have a way of revealing people's true character, and Morris's true character was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible. Dick Morris sat at the witness table like he owned the place. At 74 years old, the man they called the architect had spent decades pulling strings behind the scenes, masterminding Republican victories and crushing Democratic efforts. His resume read like a Republican Hall of Fame, chief strategist for presidential campaigns, senior advisor in the White House, and the mastermind behind some of the most ruthless political attacks in modern history. But success had made Morris arrogant. He'd grown comfortable in his role as the wise elder, the man who could lecture anyone about politics because he'd been there and done that. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, and his demeanor screamed establishment privilege. To Morris, this congressional hearing was just another opportunity to show off his supposed superior knowledge. Morris had always been comfortable in these settings: committee rooms, TV studios, private meetings with donors. These were his natural habitat. He'd learned long ago that the right tone of voice, the perfect condescending smile, and a few well-placed insults could shut down opponents before they even got started. It had worked for decades, turning him into one of the most feared political operatives in the country. But Morris had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that his old playbook would work on everyone, that his reputation alone would be enough to intimidate a young actor turned advocate. He looked at Jonathan Roumie and saw what he wanted to see: someone he could easily dismiss, someone who would back down when faced with his supposed authority. He had no idea that he was about to encounter someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The hearing was about voting rights legislation, and Morris had been called to testify about election integrity. He'd already spent 20 minutes pontificating about the real world of politics when Jonathan Roumie began asking pointed questions about voter suppression in key battleground states. That's when Morris's mask began to slip. What viewers at home didn't see was the prep work that had gone into this moment. Roumie's team had spent weeks researching Morris's history, his statements, his contradictions. They had prepared binders full of documentation, knowing that if Morris decided to make it personal, they'd be ready to respond with facts. Roumie's chief advisor had even warned him He's going to try to rattle you. He's going to try to make you look inexperienced or emotional. Don't take the bait. But Roumie had a different strategy. If he wants to make it personal, he told his team, then we'll show him what personal really looks like. We'll show him the difference between someone who earned their way here and someone who was handed everything. With all due respect, Morris had said earlier, his tone suggesting he had none, you're new to this. Some of us have been fighting these battles since before you were born. The condescension was obvious, but it was about to get much worse. Across from Morris sat Jonathan Roumie, and he was everything Morris underestimated. Roumie wasn't born with silver spoons or political connections. He had worked hard for everything he achieved in life, including his career as an actor and advocate. What Morris saw as a disadvantage, Roumie's humble beginnings, was actually Roumie's greatest strength. Those struggles had forged Jonathan Roumie into something Dick Morris could never understand. A fighter who knew what real hardship looked like and refused to back down from anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were. Roumie had earned every single thing he'd achieved. He'd worked his way through college, then law school, becoming a successful actor and activist before becoming a voice for those in need. When he entered public life, he didn't come to Washington to play nice with the establishment. He came to fight for the people who looked like him, who struggled like he had, who needed someone in the public eye who truly understood their lives. Sitting in that hearing room in his sharp business suit, his natural charm and dedication to service shining through, Roumie represented everything the old political guard feared. A young, brilliant, uncompromising man who wasn't intimidated by their power or their money. He'd seen men like Dick Morris his entire life, in acting when critics dismissed his roles or questioned his ability. In the media, when the narrative was controlled by those who didn't understand what it meant to struggle, and in the entertainment industry, when gatekeepers tried to limit his opportunities. But each of those encounters had taught him something valuable about how to handle bullies. He'd learned that the best way to deal with people who underestimated him wasn't to get angry or defensive. It was to let them reveal their true nature, then systematically dismantle their arguments with facts, intelligence, and unshakable moral authority. Roumie had been building toward this moment for years, even if he didn't know it. This confrontation was about more than voting rights legislation. It represented a clash between two Americas, the privileged political class that had run Washington for decades, and the new generation of leaders who'd fought their way to the table despite every obstacle thrown in their path. For Morris, this was supposed to be easy. Lecture the rookie, establish dominance, and move on. He'd done it countless times before with young politicians who wilted under his withering stare and sharp tongue. For Roumie, this was about every young person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every underdog from a working-class background who had been dismissed because of where they came from, every person who had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. The room was packed with reporters. C-SPAN cameras were rolling and social media was already buzzing about the tension. What started as a routine hearing was about to become a defining moment for both of their careers, and Dick Morris had no idea what was about to hit him. The trouble started when Roumie began asking specific questions about voter ID laws. He had done his homework. He had statistics, court cases, and real examples of how these laws affected his community. But Morris wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in showing everyone who was really in charge. "Mr. Roumie, you're talking about isolated incidents," Morris interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Those of us who understand how elections actually work know that these measures are necessary for integrity." The "those of us" was delivered with a smirk that suggested Roumie clearly wasn't part of that exclusive club. A few Republican committee members chuckled, thinking Morris was putting the rookie in his place, but Roumie didn't flinch. "Mr. Morris, are you suggesting that I don't understand how elections work because I've won them on my own terms, with integrity, not voter suppression tactics?" Roumie shot back, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that made experienced political watchers sit up straighter. Morris's face tightened slightly, but he pressed on, clearly enjoying what he thought was an easy target. "Look," Morris said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged. "I've been doing this since you were in elementary school. I helped elect presidents. I've seen every trick, every strategy, every excuse. What you're describing isn't voter suppression. It's ensuring that people who vote are actually qualified to vote." "Qualified according to whom?" Roumie shot back, his voice remaining steady but gaining an edge. Morris's smile turned ugly. This is where he made his fatal mistake. Instead of sticking to policy, he decided to make it personal. Mr. Roumie, maybe the problem is that you're bringing your personal experiences into a realm that requires objectivity. Not everyone had the benefit of a traditional upbringing that teaches proper respect for institutions. The room went quiet. Even the Republican committee members looked uncomfortable. Morris had just crossed a line that experienced politicians knew you never cross. He'd made it about someone's family, someone's background, someone's upbringing, but Morris wasn't done. Emboldened by what he mistook for Roumie's silence, he continued digging his own grave. I mean, let's be honest here. Some of us learned about civic responsibility and respect for law and order from stable homes with strong guidance. Others seemed to think that emotion and personal grievances should drive policy. The dog whistles were so loud they were practically air raid sirens. Every person in that room knew exactly what Morris was implying about Roumie, about someone from a working-class background who hadn't been handed everything in life. He was trafficking in every stereotype about families and communities that had been struggling. The CS-PAN cameras captured it all. Social media was already exploding. Dick Morris was starting to trend, and not in a good way. In newsrooms across the country, assignment editors were making quick decisions. This wasn't just another boring congressional hearing anymore. This was a potential viral moment in the making. Political reporters who had been half watching while checking their phones suddenly sat up straighter. Cable news producers started making calls, preparing to break into regular programming if this escalated further. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side sat Dick Morris, representing everything people hated about Washington politics. Insider dealing, coded language, the assumption that birth and connections mattered more than character and competence. On the other side sat Jonathan Roumie, representing the change that millions of Americans had been voting for. Authentic, uncompromising, and unafraid to speak truth to power. Roumie sat there for a moment, and anyone who knew him could see the storm building behind his eyes. He'd heard these coded attacks his entire life. He'd faced them in acting school, in the entertainment industry, and now here in the halls of Congress. But this time was different. This time he had a national platform. This time he had the receipts. And this time Dick Morris had just made the biggest mistake of his political career. "Mr. Morris," Roumie said, his voice deadly calm, "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you suggesting that my upbringing was somehow deficient?" Morris, completely missing the danger he was in, doubled down. "I'm suggesting that different backgrounds provide different perspectives, and some perspectives are more grounded in traditional American values." The committee chairman, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should return to the substance of the legislation," but Morris held up his hand. No, I think this is important. Mr. Roumie raised questions about qualifications, and I think the American people deserve to understand where these questions are coming from. He turned back to Roumie with that same condescending smile. "I had the benefit of learning about civic duty and responsible governance from parents who understood the importance of stability, discipline, and respect for authority. That foundation shapes how I approach policy. Perhaps that's why we see things differently." The implication was crystal clear. Roumie's single mother hadn't provided proper guidance. His community hadn't taught him proper values, and he was somehow lesser because of it. What Morris didn't understand, what men like him never understood, was that he wasn't saying anything Roumie hadn't heard before. These weren't new attacks or original insults. They were the same tired stereotypes that had been used against working-class families for generations. The same assumptions that said, if you didn't come from money, you didn't have values. The same prejudices that equated struggle with failure, poverty with inadequacy. But there was something else Morris didn't understand. Every time someone had used these attacks against Roumie, they'd only made him stronger. Every dismissive comment, every coded insult, every assumption about his capabilities had been fuel for the fire that drove him to work harder, study longer, and fight fiercer than anyone expected. Now, sitting in this congressional hearing room with the eyes of the nation watching, Dick Morris was about to discover what happened when those weapons were turned against someone who had spent his entire life building immunity to them. It was classist. It was elitist. It was everything wrong with American politics wrapped up in one supposedly polite package. The moment crystallized something that had been building for years in American politics. Here was the old guard represented by a 74-year-old man who had never faced real adversity, trying to use the same tired playbook that had worked for decades. Attack someone's background, question their legitimacy, make them defend their right to be at the table instead of focusing on the issues at hand. But this time, the target wasn't going to play defense. This time, the target was going to show the country what happened when preparation met opportunity, when intelligence met courage, when someone who had earned everything they'd achieved faced someone who had been handed everything they'd received, and Jonathan Roumie was about to destroy him for it. Roumie stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and somehow made every person in the room hold their breath. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been underestimated their entire life and was about to remind everyone why that was a mistake. "Mr. Morris," he began, and the calmness in his tone was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Since you've decided to make this about upbringing and values, let me tell you about mine. I was raised by a single mother in New York. My father wasn't consistently in the picture, which I'm sure delights you to hear since it fits your narrative so perfectly." Morris shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going where he'd expected. "My mother, Betty Roumie, worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. She cleaned offices at night after working as a secretary during the day. She never complained, never made excuses, and never let us think for 1 second that we were less than anyone else because we had less money than anyone else." Roumie's voice began to rise, not with anger but with pride. "She taught me that your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your father's name, or whether you grew up in a mansion or an apartment. She taught me that integrity means fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. She taught me that respect is earned, not inherited." The room was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. "But let me tell you what else my mother taught me, Mr. Morris. She taught me the value of education. So I worked my way through college, where I graduated with honors. Then I worked my way through law school while working full-time to pay for it." Roumie began walking toward the witness table, and Morris actually leaned back in his chair. "I became an advocate for civil rights, Mr. Morris. Do you know what that means? It means I spent years fighting against people who thought exactly like you do. People who believe that your background determines your worth, that your zip code determines your intelligence, that your family structure determines your character. I won cases against voter suppression. I won cases against housing discrimination. I won cases against employment discrimination. I did it by outworking, outstudying, and out-arguing people who had every advantage I didn't have." Now he was standing directly in front of the witness table, looking down at Dick Morris, who suddenly seemed much smaller than he had when this all started. "Then I ran for office and won. Then I ran for Congress and won. Do you know how I won those elections, Mr. Morris? By earning the trust of people who look like me, who struggled like I struggled, who understood that I would fight for them because I am them. So when you sit there in your expensive suit with your perfectly styled hair, talking about traditional American values and proper upbringing, let me tell you what I hear. I hear a man who's never had to work on anything he's achieved, lecturing a man who's had to work for everything he's achieved." The committee room was so quiet you could hear the C-SPAN cameras humming. "You want to talk about values, Mr. Morris? Let's talk about your values. You're the man who built a career on divide and conquer politics. You're the man who pioneered the politics of personal destruction. You're the man who turned political discourse into a blood sport where anything goes as long as your side wins." Roumie pulled out a folder that had been sitting on his desk throughout the hearing. "Since you brought up qualifications, let me refresh everyone's memory about your track record. You were the architect of the Iraq War sales job. Weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. Connections to 9/11 that weren't real. A war that cost thousands of American lives and trillions of American dollars." Morris's face was turning red. He tried to interrupt, but Roumie wasn't finished. "You were behind the swift boat attacks on John Kerry, questioning the war record of a decorated Vietnam veteran. You orchestrated the firing of U.S. attorneys for political reasons. You turned the Justice Department into a partisan weapon. So let's compare our values, Mr. Morris. My mother taught me to tell the truth, even when it's hard. You built a career on lies and manipulation. My mother taught me to fight for the underdog. You built a career crushing anyone who got in your way. My mother taught me that everyone deserves respect and dignity. You just spent the last 10 minutes trying to diminish me because of where I came from." Roumie leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. Morris actually flinched. "The difference between us, Mr. Morris, is that I earned my place at this table. You were born on third base and spent your whole life thinking you hit a triple. But here's what really bothers me about what you said. You insulted my mother. You insulted every single mother who's working multiple jobs to raise her children. You insulted every kid who's ever grown up without a father and wondered if that made them less than other kids. You insulted every family that struggled to make ends meet. Her voice rose to fill the entire room, and you did it while sitting at a witness table in the United States Congress, speaking under oath, representing yourself as some kind of moral authority. The emotion in her voice was real but controlled. This wasn't anger. This was righteous fury tempered by intelligence and focused like a laser. My mother may not have had money, Mr. Morris, but she had something you clearly never learned. Class. She would never ever insult someone's family to score political points. She would never attack someone's background to make herself feel superior. She would never use her platform to punch down at people who had less than she did. Roumie straightened up and looked directly into the C-SPAN cameras. So yes, Mr. Morris, my upbringing was different from yours. I was raised by a woman who taught me that your character is measured by how you treat people who can't do anything for you. I was raised to believe that public service means serving the public, not serving yourself. I was raised to understand that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. He turned back to Morris, who was staring at the table, unable to meet his eyes. And if that's not traditional American values to you, then maybe the problem isn't with my upbringing. Maybe the problem is with your understanding of what America is supposed to be about. The room exploded. The Democratic committee members were applauding. Several Republicans looked visibly uncomfortable. The reporters were frantically typing. And Dick Morris sat there in complete silence, utterly and completely destroyed by a man he thought he could dismiss with a few coded insults. It was over. In less than 10 minutes, Jonathan Roumie had not only defended himself, but he'd exposed Dick Morris as exactly the kind of privileged, out-of-touch political operative that Americans were tired of. And he'd done it with the same grace, intelligence, and dignity that his mother had taught him in that modest apartment in New York all those years ago. The committee chairman sat stunned for a full 30 seconds before remembering he needed to maintain order. When he finally gave for quiet, the damage was already done. Dick Morris, the man who'd entered the hearing room with supreme confidence, couldn't even look up from the witness table. I think we should move on to other questions, the chairman stammered, clearly unsure how to follow what had just happened. But Representative Roumie wasn't done. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Morris should be given the opportunity to respond to my comments about his record. After all, he seemed quite eager to discuss personal backgrounds just a few minutes ago. All eyes turned to Morris, the man who'd built a reputation on never backing down from a fight, who'd destroyed political careers with a few well-placed attacks, who'd been called the architect because of his strategic brilliance. Yet here he sat, in complete silence. Mr. Morris, the chairman prompted. Finally, Morris looked up. His face was pale, his usual smirk completely gone. I think Representative Roumie has made her point, he said quietly. It was a complete surrender. No comeback, no counterattack, no attempt to regain control of the narrative. Dick Morris had been intellectually and morally eviscerated, and everyone in the room knew it. Within minutes of Roumie's response, social media erupted like a volcano. The clip of his takedown was being shared faster than servers could handle. Jonathan Roumie shot to the top of trending topics on Twitter, followed closely by Dark Dick Morris, though for very different reasons. The video clips were brutal for Morris. The contrast between his smug attack on Roumie's upbringing and Roumie's dignified, devastating response made him look like exactly what he was, a privileged bully who'd finally picked on someone who could fight back. Conservative Twitter was in damage control mode, but even many Republicans were distancing themselves from Morris's comments. This isn't who we are, posted one GOP strategist. Personal attacks on someone's family background have no place in political discourse. Meanwhile, Democratic activists and progressive organizations were having a field day. This is what it looks like when someone with real values takes on the swamp, posted one viral tweet that was retweeted over 100,000 times. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary Americans who saw themselves in Roumie's story. Single mothers shared their own struggles. First-generation college graduates talked about being underestimated. People of color discussed facing similar coded attacks throughout their careers. Political commentators were calling it one of the most devastating takedowns they'd ever witnessed. CNN's chief political analyst said, "I've covered politics for 30 years, and I've never seen someone's reputation destroyed so completely in such a short time." Fox News found itself in the awkward position of trying to defend Dick Morris without seeming to endorse his attack on single mothers and working-class families. Their evening hosts focused on other aspects of the hearing, but even they couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. MSNBC ran the clip hourly for the rest of the day. This is what happens when old-school political operatives encounter new-school political talent, said one host. Morris came armed with stereotypes and condescension. Roumie came armed with facts, personal dignity, and moral authority. The Washington Post's analysis was particularly brutal. Dick Morris's attack on Jonathan Roumie's upbringing reveals everything that's wrong with modern Republican politics. The assumption that privilege equals virtue, that struggle equals weakness, and that personal attacks can substitute for policy argument. Behind the scenes, Republican leadership was furious with Morris. His attack hadn't just backfired, it had handed Democrats a perfect example of GOP elitism and insensitivity. Phone calls were made, meetings were held, and damage control efforts were launched. But it was too late. The video was everywhere, and no amount of spin could change what people had seen with their own eyes. Dick Morris, representing the Republican establishment, had attacked a man raised by a single mother and had been completely destroyed in response. Some Republicans tried to defend Morris, arguing that his comments had been taken out of context, but the full video made it clear that there was no context that could justify what he'd said or how he'd said it. Others tried to pivot to attacking Roumie's response as too emotional or inappropriate for a congressional hearing. This strategy backfired spectacularly when clips surfaced of these same Republicans praising male politicians for much more aggressive responses to personal attacks. Democratic leaders couldn't have written a better script. Here was a young, brilliant man from a working-class background demonstrating exactly the kind of moral leadership the party wanted to showcase. His defense of single mothers, working families, and the dignity of all Americans hit every note Democratic strategists had been trying to strike for years. House Democratic leadership issued a statement within hours. Representative Roumie's response today exemplifies the values and dignity that Americans expect from their elected officials. His personal story of overcoming obstacles through hard work and education is the American dream in action. Progressive groups were even more enthusiastic. Jonathan Roumie just showed the country what real strength looks like, posted one major progressive organization. While Dick Morris tried to tear him down because of where he came from, he lifted up everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. The response from celebrities and public figures was swift and overwhelming. Actors, musicians, athletes, and other politicians rushed to share clips of Roumie's response. "This is what courage looks like," tweeted one A-list actress. "When they go low, he goes higher, but he brings receipts," posted a popular comedian. Even some unexpected voices joined the chorus of praise. A former Republican strategist tweeted, "I've disagreed with Representative Roumie on policy, but what he did today was masterful." Morris was completely out of line, and he handled it with more class than he deserved. The moment had transcended partisan politics. This wasn't just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was about decency versus cruelty, authenticity versus artifice, earned respect versus inherited privilege. The confrontation had implications far beyond the immediate embarrassment for Dick Morris. It highlighted the generational and cultural shift happening in American politics, where old-school operatives who relied on coded language and personal attacks were being challenged by a new generation of politicians who refused to be intimidated. For Roumie, the moment transformed him from a newcomer to a national political star. His email list exploded with new subscribers. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Democratic donors who had never heard of him were suddenly writing checks to his campaign. More importantly, he'd proven that the new generation of Democratic politicians could not only survive attacks from the Republican establishment, they could turn those attacks into powerful moments of moral leadership. For Dick Morris, the damage was severe and lasting. Speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Television appearances became rare. The man who'd built his reputation on strategic brilliance had committed one of the most strategic blunders in modern political history. His allies tried to rehabilitate his image, arguing that he was a political genius who'd simply had a bad day. But the video made it impossible to ignore the reality. Morris had revealed himself as exactly the kind of out-of-touch elitist that voters had grown tired of. The architect had built his final structure, and it had collapsed on top of him. The confrontation resonated far beyond political circles. It became a cultural moment that spoke to broader issues of class, race, and respect in American society. Roumie's defense of his mother and his upbringing struck a chord with millions of Americans who'd faced similar dismissive attitudes throughout their lives. Teachers shared the clip with students as an example of how to respond to bullies with dignity and strength. Parents showed it to their children as a demonstration of standing up for family and values. Young people saw it as proof that you could overcome any background and compete with anyone if you were willing to work hard enough. What made Roumie's response so powerful wasn't just that he defended himself, it was that he defended everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough because of where they came from. He'd taken Morris's attempt to diminish him and turned it into a celebration of American resilience, hard work, and dignity. In a political climate filled with negativity and division, Jonathan Roumie had provided something rare, a moment of genuine inspiration that reminded people why they'd gotten involved in politics in the first place. He'd proven that sometimes the best response to an attack isn't to attack back. It's to stand up, tell your truth, and let your values speak for themselves. And he'd done it all while maintaining the grace and dignity that his mother had taught him in that modest apartment in New York all those years ago. What made Roumie's victory even more remarkable was how completely he had controlled the narrative. From the moment Morris launched his attack, he had been 3 steps ahead, methodically building his response while letting Morris dig his own grave deeper with every word. He hadn't lost his temper, hadn't resorted to personal insults, hadn't stooped to his level. Instead, he had used Morris's own weapons against him, his assumption of superiority, his coded language, his attempt to diminish him based on his background. He had taken everything Morris meant as a weakness and revealed it as strength. Every struggle Morris tried to use against him became evidence of Roumie's resilience. Every challenge Morris mocked became proof of his determination. In the end, Dick Morris had been defeated not by anger or aggression, but by the truth. The truth about his record, the truth about his values, and the truth about what real strength looks like when it's tested by privilege and power. If you enjoyed watching Jonathan Roumie dismantle Dick Morris's arrogant attack, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Political moments like this don't happen every day, but when they do, you'll want to be the first to see them. This confrontation shows us that in American politics, truth and authenticity still matter. When privileged elites try to use someone's background against them, sometimes they discover that background is actually someone's greatest strength. What did you think of Roumie's response? Was it too harsh or exactly what Morris deserved? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political courage looks like. The battle between the old guard and the new generation of political leaders is just getting started. And if this confrontation is any indication, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Moments like these remind us why representation matters, why having diverse voices in Congress is so important, and why we can never take our democracy for granted. As we continue to follow Jonathan Roumie's career and the ongoing transformation of American politics, one thing is certain. The days when powerful men could silence opposition with personal attacks and coded insults are coming to an end. The future belongs to leaders who can stand up, speak truth, and fight back with facts, dignity, and unwavering moral authority. If you enjoyed this powerful moment and want to see more stories of political courage, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring you these compelling stories, and we want to keep delivering the kind of content that keeps you informed and inspired. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with anyone who needs to see what real strength looks like in politics. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.